Thus, biography involves more than discussing a person's social or political significance. Rather, a biographer, if true to his or her craft, must tell the story of a human being. That to me has been fundamental. In writing Heaven Can Indeed Fall, the Life of Willmoore Kendall would have been much easier and sometimes more pleasant merely to discuss and analyze the man's ideas and to gloss over the sometimes messy details of his personal life. But as historian and biographer, I saw it as my job to understand and to help others understand Kendall the man, not merely to understand his intellectual constructs and chronicle his political activities. In researching and writing this biography, it quickly became clear to me, by writing in third-person past tense, as I almost always have had my students write, it's called the omniscient narrator mode. By reading letters Willmoore wrote as a preteen and reading obituaries composed after his death, I came to be empathetic with him. I came to know more about him in many respects than anyone, even his contemporaries. So that's him, age 12, a senior at Tahlequah High School, where he was a child prodigy. By reading letters Willmoore wrote as a preteen and reading obituaries composed after his death, I came to know lots about him. When reading about Kendall's great gifts as a teacher, his difficult relationships with friends and colleagues, or his struggles with alcoholism, I came back to this. I thought about this picture. And I knew where his brilliance, his contrariness, his addictive personality came from. Or as an omniscient narrator and avid researcher, I'd come to know him through his family records, even from before he was born. This book then tells a life. It shows how a child prodigy, preacher's kid, and bucolic Boy Scout became an ambitious military analyst, mesmerizing teacher, razor-tongued polemicist, and profound student of American politics. In it, I strive to be honest. Objective would be too strong a word, but to hide nothing and to avoid stretching out facts or refashioning ideas to protect my own points of view or preconceived notions. Some say biographers come either to love or to hate their subjects. For me, that has not been so. By taking so broad a look at his life as an omniscient narrator and researcher, I came to understand both the appeal and the repulsion that he and his ideas had exercised on his contemporaries. In any case, I will provide a brief outline of Willmoore Kendall's life, then discuss his significance as a historical figure, and lastly discuss the process of researching and writing his biography. He was born in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. His father, this is Mabel, but that's wrong. That should be Mabel High School, not Tahlequah. Tahlequah is where he was born. His father, Willmoore Kendall Sr., that's him, was a Methodist minister. He had a profound effect on his son's life. Reverend Kendall was intelligent, ambitious, and blind. Frustrated because of his blindness, he pushed his son relentlessly. And so that's partly why he's a child prodigy. This is Willmoore. He's the one in the knee pants, standing alone by the column. Okay, so he's a senior at Lawton High School, where he did graduate, and he graduated from Maine, but this would be the fall of 1921. And he's isolated because boys wore long pants, or adult men wore long pants. Boys wore knee pants. He's still in knee pants. His dad kept pushing him, and ultimately forced him to attend Northeastern University in Evanston, Illinois, at age 13, before he was emotionally or psychologically ready. There he is meeting the youngest ROTC cadet in America, meeting a famed and rather insane World War I general named Van Horn Mosley. He was also kind of tossed around by the football team and just kind of made a butt of a lot of jokes at Northwestern. At age 15, Willmoore, who was then a student at OU, ran away to New Orleans because his dad wouldn't let him join a fraternity. Reverend Kendall then had his son brought home in handcuffs. He made jokes to the cops that since he was blind, he couldn't really keep an eye on him, so he needed to keep putting him in handcuffs. So a lot of that stuff came out in Kendall's later life. Eventually, the younger man's brilliance showed through. He got a BA at Purdue, age 17, an MA at Northwestern 2 years later. Then received a Rhodes Scholarship and studied at Oxford from 1932, Pembroke College, 1932 to 1935. J.R.R. Tolkien was on the faculty there. He also worked with the next guy, who was a very distinguished philosopher, R.G. Cullen, who had an effect on Kendall's scholarship. In 1935, Kendall married his first wife. He had three. Here she is, Catherine Kendall. Her maiden name was Tuak, but she kept Kendall's name after their divorce in the 50s. Students interested in doing a biography, she's got a great set of papers up at the University of Minnesota. She was one of the founders of the International Social Group, so she was a pretty important person herself. Then, after graduating from Oxford, using his fluency in Spanish, Willmoore worked for United Press in Spain, in Madrid, reporting on various acts of terrorism as the country slipped into civil war. Returning home, he pursued a doctorate at the University of Illinois, taught at LSU. Among other students he taught there was future Vice President Hubert Humphrey. After receiving his doctorate, he published his first book, and this is a close reading and analysis of John Locke's Second Treatise on Government. Oops, I think I got one out here. There we go. So this is how Kendall did his scholarship, which is he looked very carefully at what authors said. He didn't read about what people said authors said. He looked at the authors himself to see what they actually did say. So, for example, Locke's first chapter of this talks about the ability of the majority to make decisions up to, including capital punishment, and natural rights comes in the second chapter, which Kendall picked up on. Kendall then got caught up in World War II, entering intelligence work. He was really good at this job. He received one promotion after another, and eventually he came to head up CIA efforts in Latin America. Actually, the CIA didn't exist until 1947, but the predecessor is what he led, and then was in the CIA itself. It's around 1946-47 that he became a conservative, in part because he exposed communists at work in his own in the CIA in Latin America. In 1946, he became a professor at Yale, though he was still working part-time for the CIA. As an argumentative conservative, he quickly made many enemies among the faculty. However, he was a colorful he had a colorful personality. There's his two prize students, L. Brett Moselle Jr. and William F. Buckley Jr. I don't know. I don't think cannabis was legal then, although Moselle was just an unusual looking man. That's kind of him in his prime. So he was a character of colorful personality. He loved to wear colorful plaid suits. He loved to put on a thick Oklahoman accent, which if you're at Yale sounds very exotic. He used that all to his advantage to attract these very important sort of icons of American conservatism. One of the things he did as a teacher, and I spent a fair amount of time in the book talking about him as a teacher. He was really a virtuoso as a teacher, and he really taught Socratically. And so for the last 5 or 6 years, those of you who've been in my classes know I don't ever lecture. I always do the question and answer Socratic. He was really good at it. I'm still a beginner at that. But he really won the hearts and minds of a lot of students at Yale. Taking a long sabbatical from Yale from 1950 to 1954, Kendall became one of the highest-ranking American intelligence officers in the Korean War. There he pioneered techniques of psychological warfare and crafted sophisticated and effective propaganda. And convincing a lot of enemy soldiers to surrender. Coming back to Yale, he spent lots of time at National Review. So he was a co-founder of National Review, which is really the journal of sophisticated conservative opinion for a long time. He skewered the left in his column called The Liberal Line. Okay, this is him sort of his military days. He left Yale for good in 1958, teaching at various universities, traveling back to Spain for a 2-year writing sabbatical, then ended up at the University of Dallas in 1963. There he founded the politics program, which is now named after him. So let me just go through some of this. He's still got his military-style haircut because he's a lieutenant colonel in the Army at this point, too. This is him at the University of Dallas. They built a special stage for him, literally an amphitheater, where he became their star teacher. You can see from 1946 to this probably about 1966, 20 years of hard living puts a lot of lines on the face. He certainly experienced that. In the early 1960s, he struggled mightily with alcohol and with the effects of the noxious drug antabuse, which makes anyone drinking liquor violently ill. It's really kind of a horror story when you read about antabuse and the effects that it had on him. Amid these struggles, he also produced much of his most astute writing and political theory. When he married his third wife, who was an ex-Marine, she is Nellie Kendall. With his conversion to Catholicism, he found a certain degree of happiness. How he had a third wife and became a Catholic at the same time is a complicated story. The story is Pope Paul VI kind of threw in the towel when Kendall submitted 2 annulments at once. That's a complex story. He smoked 3 to 5 packs of cigarettes a day, cutting back meant 3 packs a day. Only 5. And he died of a heart attack in 1967 at the relatively early age of 58. As to why it was historically important, Kendall helped kickstart the 1950s conservative movement, which toppled New Deal-style liberalism, and he constructed a unique political theory which continues to provide key insights about how democracy should function. He played a key role in formulating Buckley's, there he is dead. This is Ardmore Cemetery. I went and took the picture. This is not my picture. This is a better one. Because for copyright reasons, I needed to take another picture. And there he is in bronze, which I guess is deader than dead. In any case, he also constructed this unique political theory. He played a key role in formulating writing this book. So this is God and Man at Yale, written by William F. Buckley in 1951. Many historians believe that date the beginning of the modern conservative movement with the publication of this book. Kendall had a tremendous influence on it. He edited it word by word. A lot of its ideas are a lot more like Kendall's ideas than they are what Buckley's became. It's really about democracy, which is not one of Buckley's strong suits later on in his career, I'd say. He was also co-founder, senior editor of National Review. You'll notice his name down there at the bottom. This is the first issue of National Review from 1945. And Kendall was a senior editor of it from the beginning. I suggest in the book that Kendall was the first person who really set out to make the very word liberal a term of abuse. And that was a campaign that succeeded, but only long after his death. So much so that liberals had to rebrand themselves as progressives. But I would say Kendall's the one who kind of kicked that off. Ultimately, more important, I think, was Kendall's political. By prioritizing the value of majority rule, it has always stood outside most recognized schools of conservative thought. Unlike every other conservative I've ever read, Kendall really admired Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Much of his academic career really was an attempt to solve Rousseau's conundrum that Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. That is, Kendall wanted real democracy. He wanted to translate the genuine democracy of small places where citizens gather, talk face to face, maybe under an oak tree, and reach consensus. He wanted to make democracy as real for the larger nation states of his own day. And in this quest, he moved from being a revolutionary communist into a reactionary anti-communist. But he always focused on how to make democracy work. That is, he wanted to understand how to ensure that the will of the majority of the people, rather than the will of oligarchs, dictators, judges, or bureaucrats, might prevail in society. He hoped to empower the people to rule democratically and to uphold a functional, just, tranquil, and cohesive policy. He believed that society, simply to survive, needed a vision of the good and had to be ready to defend the vision against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Freedom, he suggested, was a great and a good thing. However, all societies had to place limits on it. And that, in fact, all societies did place limits on individual liberties, including limits on property rights and limits on the right to free speech. The main guarantor of American democracy, he thought, was careful deliberation among elected representatives. Assembled together in Congress, delegates of the people could talk through how the country should proceed and so promote the interests of their local communities and the countries and of the country as a whole. This man, Carl Albert, Speaker of the House, is the Oklahoman who has held the highest office of any at the federal level. Carl Albert was Kendall's roommate at Oxford, so they knew each other very well. And I argue in the book that Carl Albert put into practice many of the ideas that Kendall wrote about in theory. And let me talk some more about those ideas. So, Kendall decided that the original system devised by the American founders comprised the best one for stable democratic government. He started out as a Trotskyist, ended up as a Madisonian. So this system worked, he believed. Dr. Weaver gave me the word for this, preambulism, which I did not know before. This system worked by balancing the six goods enumerated in the preamble to the Constitution: union, justice, domestic tranquility, common defense, general welfare, and liberty. By valuing and talking through each of these goals, but prioritizing no one above the others, elected representatives could help the American people maintain democracy for the long haul. On the other hand, those who prioritized change above all else were dangerous. Anyone, whether from the left or the right, he hated Barry Goldwater, for example, who wanted to do justice even at the heavens fall, to cite a classical aphorism, almost guaranteed political destruction and disintegration. Promoting justice at the expense of liberty, say, or pushing liberty forward while ignoring the general welfare, could cause the entire system and the many social goods it upheld to collapse. If change agents did not gain consensus through careful deliberation among elected representatives, but instead imposed their agendas on society against the wishes of a large part of the population, serious social cleavages would almost certainly result. Heaven then could indeed fall. That's where the title from a lecture at Dallas, the title of the book came. Kendall's political theory was intricate and nuanced, and we don't have time to do it justice here. It has, however, many implications for the present discontents of our age, particularly for the future of conservatism, as the once triumphant Reagan-era vision of untrammeled free market capitalism seems to have collapsed. But my talk here is about the nature and vocation of researching and writing biography, rather than about politics or political theory as such. So let's move on. Unlike novelists or poets, forgive me, Dave Weinberger, historians and biographers can't just make stuff up. This is here and there. So first I try to read everything he'd written and published or been published about him. Then I hit various archives. Most important were the Kendall papers, about 33 boxes at Stanford. The William F. Buckley papers at Yale, about 400 boxes at Yale. And I traveled to these collections in person, making notes, although you can take pictures with key documents instead of writing them out in pencil, which saves a lot of time. Some other universities made copies available to me, University of Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, etc., and sent them to me. Kendall did not publish many books, so I went in thinking, well, I had a couple of my students, Paul Farley, and some other students who were Michael Jocelyn, who'd written great MA thesis biographies, and I thought, hey, I could do this. And look, here's this guy from Oklahoma, really interesting. Nobody's written a biography on him. Hey, he only wrote a couple of books, no problem. Little did I know that the man wrote gazillions of letters, like a million gazillion. So I had to read through those. He spends time writing letters instead of books, actually. These were really essential in understanding his life. And if you don't want the dirty details of your life, burn your letters. Because he left a lot of that in his letters. Another key source for me was newspapers, mostly accessed electronically. And here it helped me that my guy had a weird name, Willmoore. I could do a search on that, and it would pop up, and there wouldn't be too many extraneous hits. If your guy's name Bob Smith, it's going to be a little more difficult. This technology has been a great advantage for researchers compared to past days. I'd have had to wander more or less aimlessly through rolls of microfilm, and electronic access let me discover document aspects of his life, which would have remained hidden or taken me 15 years to find without it. I want to just look at an example. This is from chapter 1. And I'm going to read this first part, and then I'm going to tell you how I did it. So all of this stuff is new. Nobody had written about this before. So this is chapter 1. Much had happened since he left. Reverend Kendall's pastoral charge in Mayneville ended disastrously when he angered the Ku Klux Klan by announcing his fault. In January 1922, he took out an ad in a local paper to announce an anti-Klan talk. In July, after the Mayneville branch of the Invisible Empire Grove, Kendall announced another lecture in the local paper criticizing the Klan again. This time, they burned a fiery cross in his yard. In July, Willmoore Jr., he's at Northwest. He's about to go to Northwestern, so he's 13. Told his dad he's afraid he's going to get targeted. Sunday, August, at a revival in nearby town of Grant, 25 rogue Klansmen made a call on Reverend Kendall. There to praise his work theoretically and promoting Christian brotherhood, they gave him a letter vowing to maintain forever the God-given supremacy of the white race in all things. Faced with this hostility, Kendall asked for a transfer. Church authorities granted his request, transferring him to Eastern Oklahoma. In November, he left town in a hurry, not waiting for his replacement to arrive. So I didn't know any of this. Nobody had ever written about this part. We knew when he was applying for that's about it. So the Kendall papers, that's Willmoore Kendall and Willmoore Kendall Sr. I found some documents about his time writing about some of it. The rest of it I found pretty much in newspapers, using newspapers.com, which is a fantastic resource for historians. And I just pieced it together. I just searched for Willmoore, and boom, it popped up, and here he is here's his ad against the Klan. Here's this talk from the revival, and here's this other talk that he gave at the church. And then I got some records from the United Methodist Church Archives at OCU, and realized he'd been driven out of town and was transferred all the way across the state to get as far away from Memphis. Okay, so that was more like being a detective, just finding out what was happening, using the sources that I was able to access. But writing biography also means more than digging up previously known facts. It requires interpreting more readily accessible information published in books, scholarly articles. Willmoore Kendall hated historians. He scorned us. He thought we were fact grubbers, that we just piled up one footnote reference after another to repeat the conventional wisdom. The reason reading Kendall is really fun is because he hated conventional wisdom. Anything you said, he would disagree with you about. It didn't really matter what it was. So he had a horror of the conventional wisdom. And instead of accepting what other scholars said about Socrates, or Locke, or John Stuart Mill, He went directly back to the sources themselves to read and interpret them afresh. Okay? So, for example, he goes to this conference of conservatives talking about Socrates. The people of Athens, absolutely right to put him to death. Okay? Absolutely within the right. Everybody's shocked. But he loved, that's what he liked. He liked to shock people and say outrageous things. He criticized Barry Goldwater. He criticized Albert Schweitzer, Billy Graham, you name it. There were no sacred cows for him. But it's fun to read for that reason. You never get the same old, but always something new and intriguing. Even people who hate his ideas learn. Because it's always like, I never thought about it. And that's when he's fun to read. But he's hard to read, because he chooses his scholarly stuff. That's why I thought, not only wrote a couple of books, no problem, but his stuff is super dense. It's not quite like reading Thomas Aquinas, but he chooses every sentence very carefully. Every word he writes, he chooses carefully to use in the way he wants to use that. Partly out of deference to Kim, and partly because I valued this approach. He picked a lot of it up from the new critics at LSU. He was good friends with Clint Brooks, who was one of the new critics. So I'm not going to read this whole thing, but instead of relying, I tried to read Kendall himself, to read him myself, and not to rely on what others had said about what he said. So this is a paragraph from his book, Democracy in the American Party System, a textbook that he wrote jointly with Austin Ronnie. I know that Kendall wrote this particular part of it, and so I just did a précis of it. I summarized it, and then I analyzed what he said myself. So there's only one reference here. That's the original source. I didn't really say what other scholars had said about this particular book, because I wanted to read it afresh and tell readers what I myself thought about it. It's kind of interesting here. He's talking about you want to think about making democracy real in a large nation. Look at the medieval town meetings. Try to blow up that model to the national level, and that's a way that you can maybe try to promote democracy in the nation state. Writing the book was then a distinct task. I decided to write chronologically, intertwining analysis of Kendall's ideas with the colorful adventures and misadventures of his life.
So I got to run.
As a historian, I think chronologically, and as people who live chronologically, so this format seemed the best after toying with topical arrangement. The publisher limited me to 100,000 words. My first draft totaled about 160,000 words. I overwrote intentionally, but then I edited it down. I reworked each chapter. Honestly, I reworked each sentence several times, and ended with a text of 99,999 words. A little over a year ago, as the manuscript neared completion, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say this, but I will. A strange feeling came over me, and it was a feeling I've never had before. And that was the feeling of being an artist. And that I was putting my skills as a historian to use to create a piece of art. And that sounds strange, sounds egotistical. It's not a thing I would have said 2 or 3 years ago. But it's accurate. That's the feeling I came to have. And that feeling has also meant to me that I don't really care that much how critics treat the book. Maybe they'll think it reveals too much of his personal life, or it's too supportive of Kendall's political theory. That's okay. It doesn't really matter, because I know I wrote the book I wanted to write, and I did write it. And honestly, I don't really care how well it sells, which my good buddy Tom Hawken in Texas tells me is good because I signed the world's worst contract with my publisher. And then priced the book. It's a crazy, don't ask me. It's expensive. Anybody who wants a discount, you can get a third discount right now. I'll give you the code. You get a discount. But it's expensive unless you do Kindle. For Heaven Indeed Came Indeed Falls, the book I needed to write, which I did. In doing so, I was able to draw on the wisdom and skills which my own teachers, historians such as Daniel Berrigan and Alf Andrew McGoy at the University of Georgia, Rufus Spain and Gary Hull at Baylor, Dan Carter, Jim Moore, Betsy Fox University at Emory had provided to me. which I hope I've provided to some of my students here at Northeastern State University. Hopefully the book's going to put a new spotlight on Willmoore Kendall, a positive one, I hope, but more importantly, a true one. And as his biographer, I am content to fade into the background and let the subject receive the attention it is properly due to. And if anybody's got any questions before you go for the cookies and stuff, I'd be happy to answer it. Don't feel obligated to ask or not to ask. Put me on the spot. Come on, you can ask. And by the way, after the cookies and stuff and all that, everybody's cleared. Anyone who's interested in an age, I'm going to go smoke a cigar at the pub, the Kroner pub. Yes.
Can you repeat the question back here?
Yeah, so that's how I went round and round with the publisher to get it back off. I'm hoping it'll be out of paperback eventually. Yes, zero at least. I'm not expecting them to make any money off of it. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. 2015, I was teaching a class in my favorite class, probably, is American Intellectual History, and I had assigned God and Man at Yale. A lot of textbooks. My textbook I've used for a long time. Good textbook on American intellectual history readings, but it overrepresents the left, I would say. So I was always trying to balance it with some conservative voices. And I ran across this guy, and I realized he was from Oklahoma. I'd never heard of him before. And I realized he was really interesting, and nobody had ever written a biography about him. So I did pretty quickly that I wanted to do that. And the rest is history, I guess. Yeah. Go ahead, Dr. Weaver.
You talked about his influence on contemporary Buckland, but how do you think Kendall's views relate to contemporary research?
Yeah, well, really what I think is he had an influence, a pretty profound influence on the early Buckley. And then Kendall was kind of, after about 1958 or 59, he was eased out of that circle. So as conservatism was coming to be more, with Nixon and Reagan win more victories, Kendall was kind of, well, he was dead, but he'd already been kind of pushed out of the loop. So for example, there's one of Buckley's favorite sayings is that he would be rather be governed by the first 1,000 names in the New York phone book than by the faculty of Harvard. That's not really Buckley's thing. That's Kendall. So what I do in the book is I call Kendall a populist. And partly because of growing up where I grew up, populist to me is not an insult. Populist is a good thing. And in the early Buckley had more of that populistic tone that was kind of alien to his own background. With Kendall out of the way, he sort of went in for the Reagan free market capitalism thing. And Kendall was kind of a forgotten voice. But conservatives continue to read him as kind of a path not taken. And so now with the rise of national conservatism or populism, people are starting to read him. But it was just coincidental that I started to write the book. It had nothing to do with wanting to write the book, at least originally. A lot of people are looking at Kendall's ideas again for that reason, as an alternative, a conservative alternative to what it had been in the last 34 years. Yeah.
What advice would you give to people who are starting out their career in history?
Okay, good. I would say pursue it if that's what you love. You know, if what you love is money, there's more lucrative routes to pursue. I I would say if you're going to, well, graduate school particularly, go to a school that is good. If you're going to graduate school, find a person who's doing scholarship that you respect, and become a protege of that person. And don't get bogged down into the ins and outs of the politics of that particular place, but really focus on honing in your skill as a historian and your duty as a scholar and professionally to exercise your gifts as a historian in the way that you ought to do. Because, really this bit I started out with about the past, I really feel like when I'm writing about the past, I feel like I have a duty to those past persons to treat them fairly, to not to put horns and tails or halos on them, but to treat them as real people who lived in their own time and place. So find a historian who will work with you in doing that. You're in the right place. Yeah.
Chris, why did the publisher limit you to 100,000 words?
More words is more expense in publishing, so I discovered that my publisher is Lexington Books, and they've been good to me for the most part, but they're really focused on the academic library market, and so they're not really necessarily looking to sell lots and lots of books. And so it's the fewer words, the fewer pages they have to print, and less expensive. But I would say that was kind of valuable, that whole artist thing I talked about. It's kind of like if somebody gives you you've got to paint your painting on this piece of, it's 2 by 3 feet or whatever. You just fit it to that. And that was okay. And then maybe the book was better for being short, really, because it made me try to focus in and hone in on what I really thought was important. Yeah.
You talked about moving and sharing. I was wondering if you were the historical authority.
Oh gosh. Well, Rousseau, I mentioned. He really liked Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Oddly enough, I know that as a Catholic, you might, I know it was Martin, I know, probably. So, oddly enough, the Catholic thinker he liked of all people was John Corby Murray, the Jesuit, who believed that American democracy was kind of rooted in medieval Catholicism, and is usually regarded as a liberal in Catholic circles, but that's probably the person he admired most in that regard. There were other people that he liked. A lot of them were, he trashed conservatives and liked liberals oftentimes. He really hated cloudy thinking. So actually, the guy I'm writing my next biography on, Clinton, a guy named Clinton Rossiter, Kendall wrote some of the most vicious reviews you'll ever hear about how muddled in the head he was in his thinking. That got me interested in Rossiter. But yeah, so let's see, political figures. Oddly enough, he's accused of hating Abraham Lincoln, but I don't think he did. I think he kind of admired Lincoln. Hated Nixon, hated Eisenhower, I can tell you, this is surprising. His favorite president, Lyndon Johnson, of all people. He considered Johnson to be a conservative, and considered Barry Goldwater to be an insane radical. So, not a thing you normally expect to hear from conservatives, but that was given. You get strange things like that you don't expect. I think he liked Johnson because he believed that Johnson served the great society. Kendall was not a free market conservative. He was actually, his economics were like the British Labour Party, which is also strange for conservatives, but he thought the Great Society helped ordinary people. And he also believed that the Civil Rights Act, partly because it was passed by Congress, the way change is supposed to occur, was a valuable and good thing, which very few conservatives at the time had anything on that. But he did support that. So a little strange. Yeah?
What events caused him to become Catholic so late in life?
Okay, well, yeah, so he became Catholic. He actually became Catholic in the mid-50s. He became Catholic when his second marriage broke up. and he became distraught. One of his students was Father Stanley Perry, one of his students at Yale. Perry became for a while the head of the political science department at Notre Dame. And Buckley, William F. Buckley had a very devout Catholic family, and Buckley had a profound influence on Kendall. So Buckley was his godfather, his sponsor, coming into the church in 54, I think it was. And Father Perry was the priest who received him into the church at that time. So he's basically broken and distraught from his marriage. Very Kendall-like. I think even as his second marriage was breaking up, he was thinking, how do I get an annulment so I can get married? So that's not, he's not, I joke that he's the world's worst Catholic. I guess there's a lot of room there for that kind of competition for that title, right? He's not necessarily a model that you'd want to follow. But I would say about that, he took his Catholicism very seriously. So much so that he spent a ton of money getting those annulments. He had to go wrong. I mean, annulments weren't like today, where they're fairly easy to obtain and very hard. And his third wife was Catholic. He wanted to marry her in the church, and about 6 months before he died, he was able to do that. And as a Catholic, I know that he gave this is sort of in the church stuff, but he had a general confession about 2 days before he died. That's about all I can say about it. So, in fact, Father Bethel, Dr. Anderson Smith, Father Bethel's book, we talked about it for pedagogy in a class, but I'm a little afraid to give the book to him because there's a lot of less than monthly stuff in the book. Yes.
Is there a conservative movement in the United States without Kendall?
Well, there's a classical liberal movement, which is what I would consider Buckley a national leader is. Yeah, there's a conservative movement, but it's not the conservatism of national conservatism or populism. It's an elitist conservatism. So Kendall was very much not an elitist. He combines, he's got Okie roots, Okie and Oxford. It's kind of an unusual combination. Yes. In the back there.
Any time while you were writing.
Okay, no, you go ahead. Go ahead, Ms. Johnson.
Apologies.
Yeah, go ahead.
Any time while you were writing the book, did you have any difficulties, or what was your biggest obstacle?
I never really had writer's block. I mean, a lot of it was just having the time. The university gave me some time off. I did get some grants to go do the research. So really, I loved doing the research. I loved reading letters. I knew learning about dirt on people's lives is kind of fun. And writing it really wasn't too bad. I don't know. It felt different from my previous book, which was competent and good, but this one I felt like I was doing what I needed to do. So it really wasn't hard. It just took a long time. Yeah. Yes, in the back.
Did Willmoore ever, what was the end of the story with his dad? Did they part amicably?
His dad, after he moved out, his dad became a super helicopter parent, gave him unending torrents of advice.
It's okay.
His dad died in a dramatic way. His dad had a brain tumor, and he started going kind of crazy, and he would have he'd get paralyzed in the pulpit before an entire congregation. So ultimately his dad was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and the doctors gave him a 1% chance of surviving, and he had the operation anyway, and died. So that was the end.
Oh my goodness.
They never really reconciled, I would say. I mean, they spoke, but they were, he kind of worked his skit quite a bit. One thing I did try to do is avoid stuff like that. Unfortunately, his dad was a helicopter parent because you know, his dad did what he did, and that some of the things, Willmoore's alcoholism and so forth, and his contrariness undoubtedly came from that. But also his gifts probably came from that too. You know, his pushing. I mean, Kendall, I think he might have could have got it. I know his dad gave the commencement speech at NSU in 1932 or something. And I believe Willmoore, NSU tried to hire him to head its languages department. So he could have been an obscure professor at Northeastern State University and lived to 83 and had a happy life with lots of happy kids. But we would have never heard of him, or at least only us here would have heard of him. So it was what it was, you know. And he was what he was for the good and the bad. And his dad was part of that, both for the good and the bad, I would say. So don't hate your parents. They are doing the best they can. Yeah.
Since you started in 2015, how many hours did you combine altogether?
Oh, gosh. I couldn't count. My wife's back there, and I just ignored. Unfortunately, I gotta say, I ignored my family for big swaths of time, trying to write it, and then doing the research and being gone for 3 or 4 weeks at a time. You know, it was. I know a lot of businessmen who do that all the time, but I'm not really used to that. So, being gone by myself, living in a hotel, and, you know, going through those papers was pretty intense, but it was enjoyable. So, gosh, I wouldn't even answer to you. I spent many summers writing. I spent a lot of time. I would say at a place like NSU, it's kind of tough because we have a pretty heavy teaching load. You've got to really focus on that, and you have your family life, and you've got to focus on that. And if you're going to do a lot of research and writing, that takes a lot of time too. So it's difficult to balance that. Places at Yale or Harvard, they teach like 1 class a year, 2 classes a year. It's a lot different. So it's a lot easier to do your scholarship at a place like that. But I think it's important that we do it at a place like at NSU too, because that keeps us in contact with. It's not just about the institution, and it's not just about best practices. A lot of it is about us showing what a historian, what a scholar really can do to you. Because you guys can do this too. You guys are smart enough. You can be great. Even you, Mr. Coleman. You can do it. So it's important to do that. And, you know, my colleagues, it's important for us to keep our scholarship up and not get sucked into the, you know, different ins and outs or common, you know, changes or whatever the state budget is this year or whatever. Don't get too focused in on it, I would say. Focus in on your craft. Yeah.
The biography present in the terms of you mentioned the artist.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I think some of Kendall's surviving friends are going to not like the book because I do put some of the stuff in. It's not really, you know, doesn't put him in the best light. But I really did. Early on, I decided that was the model that I needed to follow. I met a guy who's writing Buckley's biography, a guy named Sam Tannenhouse, who was the editor of the New York Times Book Review for a while. He wrote a really good biography of Whittaker Chambers, the author of Witness. Whittaker Chambers had a secret gay life. And Tannenhouse, you know, wrote all about that. And I thought, that's what I need to do. That did not make me like Tannenhouse less, or it didn't make me like Whittaker Chambers less. It made me understand him better as a well-rounded person and who he really was. So I decided pretty early that that's what I was going to do. And also, Kendall's legend kind of overwhelmed his thought. So his legend is kind of notorious. I mean, they had the Willmoore Kendall Memorial Couch at National Review where he was called en flagrante with the secretary. You know, so. And gosh, some of the letters where he and Buckley cuss each other out are just masters of nasty invective. So I had to kind of deal with that. And so I found some of that. What I really hope is my readers will see that his childhood experiences really produced it, and that his alcoholism, if we really think alcoholism is a disease and not a moral failing, you cut some people some slack for that, I guess. But that's part of his story, one way or the other. So, yeah, if I write it, I wasn't looking for dirt. I wasn't really looking for that. So hopefully I'm not going to scare off other people who want to write their biographies. Because I wasn't looking for that. That's just what was there. That's what I found. So I decided that to do a true portrait of him, that's what I needed to do. I've seen one review already who said, do they need to know about his private life, to know about his importance as a thinker? That's not what I wanted to do. I didn't want to talk about him, just his importance as a thinker. I wanted to reveal him as a person. And so that's what I tried to do. There's just a lot of that there. He would have been awesome. He could, honestly, when I first started reading him, my first reaction was, I do not want this person to ever read anything I wrote, because he could rip it to absolute shreds and make me feel like reading. Because he was really good at that. Yeah. I think I gave him a real portrait, so I guess one of my whole things all along has been, we're human beings and we're not devils and we're not angels. And so I tried to portray him as he was, the good, the bad, the ugly. People loved him and were fascinated by him. I met a guy who was his student. This guy's 95 years old, living at Berkeley, like a crazy liberal, but he was a Willmoore Kendall student. And he still, Willmoore as a teacher, he thought was the best teacher we'd ever seen. And he really structured his own teaching career on Kendall's Socratic style as a teacher. So interesting. That was interesting. So I just tried to tell it like it was. I think he'd be a fun guy to have drinks with. He's still drinking, 12 hours from now, and you're under the table. So he would be fun the whole time. Yeah. Are we running out of time, Ian, or are we still good? Okay. Yeah.
On the subject of complexity, in terms of Kendall as a thinker, it can be very difficult to synthesize, especially in this sort of biographical approach, a person's beliefs, even in academic beliefs, right? A book sometimes represents a single coherent viewpoint, maybe, but you mentioned Madison, for example. Madison in his 30s at the convention is very different than Madison as president.
That's
very
right.
different than Madison at the end of his life, right?
That's
There's no real single Madisonian view of government. And so, with someone like Kendall, and academics are often a little bit freer with the government on the basis of our ideas. How do you synthesize Kendall's views down into a summary like one you provided here?
I think just reading everything he wrote is step one, and some of that he wrote in letters. So there's debates about what school he fits into, and I've basically concluded he doesn't really fit into any particular school. And I think about what you were saying at first, especially, that's one of the things I admired about Kendall, is he didn't really get stuck because he kept reading. And so his political theory kept changing because there's some themes that stick out. I think the theme on democracy is one that sticks out really even when he was a Trotskyist and later. So his theory kept changing. And so what I say is his final theory is probably his best-selling book was published posthumously, Basic Symbols of the American People, but his theory would have kept changing if he'd lived because he wasn't stuck. So he's actually important because he kind of changed gears in the middle of his life after he read people like Leo Strauss and Eric Voegelin. That made him change some of his own ideas. And so he didn't become a disciple of theirs. He adapted his own ideas to what he read in them. And so his ideas changed over time. With Madison, he actually preferred to use Publius rather than Madison because he wanted to take a shot at the Federalist when it was written, without distinguishing who wrote what piece. So he really preferred that to Madison per se.
Well, that raises an important question I'm going to follow up with, which is, as a historian, as someone who's now reached retirement at the end of one career, and who this is an example, right? That is not reading Madison at the end of his life,
That's
but
true.
relatively early.
That is true.
Should we give priority in saying what Kendall thought to what he thought at the time he was dead? Why not? Why isn't Kendall as a Trotskyist?
Sure, and I try to do that. I try to do that. So I try to talk about his Trotskyist phase, and had a phase as an absolute majoritarian, where he said 50% plus one get to tell 50% minus one what to do, and they've got to obey. So that's not a very nuanced approach. But I try to do justice and to analyze the articles that he wrote in that period in his Trotskyist phase too. I don't think he was very serious as a Trotskyist. Unlike James Burnham, who was like the vice president of and he's a founder of National League. He was a very boring Trotskyist. But Kendall was less. He was sort of a fellow traveler, I guess. Yeah. Okay, anybody else? Well, I appreciate all the good questions. It's good. Dr. Anderson wants to